Welcome to our National Conversation, a podcast in which we discuss politics from all angles. We are completely nonpartisan, and all views, respectfully stated, are welcome here. Our podcast is unique in that it is hosted and run by students who are focused on finding solutions to the biggest problems facing America.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to our National Conversation, a podcast where we have respectful dialogue and try to understand perspectives we disagree with. The current date is January 31st. It's Friday when we're recording this, and we're going to be talking about government efficiency today, government spending, the recent debacle with federal funding, that sort of thing. We'll see where the conversation takes us. I'm joined today by the same crowd that we had last week, but it's a fun crowd. We have Tania Ortiz, who is our Director of Community at our National Conversation. We have Eric McElvin, who is a policy content writer with ONC. And then I am Sam Taylor, and I am the Chief Operating Officer at ONC. But just so everyone's kind of oriented, let's go through and just see generally, like as a general rule when we approach policy and ideological issues, kind of where we stand. So Eric, you would be a self-described conservative, is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. I pretty much consider myself a conservative aligned solely on social issues. When it comes to economic issues, I'm more of a mixed bag. And foreign policy is really where I enjoy doing most of my studies. So yeah, conservative.
Got it. You know, it's kind of interesting that you mentioned that. I would classify myself as kind of a hodgepodge of a bunch of different things, but on social issues, I tend to be quite progressive.
Okay,
So
interesting.
yeah, we'll see kind of where the conversation takes us here. Tania, we've talked a lot about politics, and I think that you're kind of also a hodgepodge. Maybe you classify yourself as a moderate. I'm not sure. Like, what would you say is a term or terms that could describe you generally?
Moderate because there's so many, perspectives on certain social or political and economic issues that I just can't just stay with one side of the table. I have to go, triangle form. I have to go with a lot of different sides to really believe it. But I'm more so moderate. Yeah, I go left, I go right, I go green, I go everywhere.
Yeah. No, absolutely. Yeah, and people are always more nuanced than a single political label. But hopefully that orients us a little bit going into this conversation. So yeah, let's just jump right in. Let's start with the most proximate thing, the whole pause on federal grant programs, the courts stopping of that pause, the White House rescinding the pause, but still being committed to reviewing all the programs to ensure they align with Trump's financial priorities. Obviously, this caused a great big stir. I see in the news tons of Democrats saying this is a huge breach of executive authority, balance of power, checks and balances. It's kind of an overreach there. Maybe it's even dictatorial in a sense. And I see Republican lawmakers, for the most part, looking at this and just saying, he's just kind of doing what he promised, He's just taking a look, seeing what will occur. In terms of redistributing federal funds, making sure we're being efficient, all of that stuff. I see a few Republicans saying that they wish Trump had notified people earlier. But it seems there's, for the most part, a very big partisan split on what the heck this was, what it represents. So let's just kind of go through and see where we're standing here. Tania, let's start with you. With this huge debacle over the past few days, what's just your general reaction?
Well, my general reaction was that what a confusing memo. Let's actually look at the text. It says federal agencies are to identify and review all federal financial assistance programs and supporting activities consistent with the president's policies and requirements, and to suspend distribution of this funding while the review was underway, and the funding was to go under pause the following day at 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So it was confusing in the sense that it was a very broad application of it. You had to just assume what they meant by federal financial assistance programs and supporting activities. And we also had to assume what it meant with president's policies and requirements. So there was a lot of assumptions going on what this could mean. So everyone panicked, and rightly so, I would say, because there was concerns with Social Security, concerns with Medicaid. And it's only when the president came back and said, actually, guys, that's Social Security is okay, Medicare be okay, and they said that programs that are like directly benefiting citizens won't be like removed from funding. Okay, they could have said in the first memo. I think it just brought a lot of confusion, a lot of fear. I think this also is just becoming a sort of litmus test, right, on how much can the Republican Party accept from Trump before they're going to come out and say, okay, big guy, let's see what's up. Let's be more mindful when sending out these memos or sending out these executive orders, because it comes from my perspective that these aren't rooted in reason, or maybe it's reason, but it's not good reason. I think we're not thinking these issues out and understanding the implications this may have for our citizens. But this mostly comes to concern for me is that the idea we're treating the American government as a business. It doesn't work that way. I'm so sorry. I know a lot of people love Trump because he's this business typhoon. He has all this knowledge, but it's not practical and it's not realistic to apply those same measurements you would in business to the United States government. It's just, I don't think it's actually going to work. And again, if he's looking to save money, I want to know. I want to see a plan. I said this last week. I want to see a financial plan. If you're gonna, typical business do this. You're cutting costs, but you're also giving a plan. I want to see that plan if he has it then. But that was my immediate reaction.
Thank you, Tania. And Eric, we were kind of pre-gaming the discussion a little bit. You shared some of your thoughts on this. I think you said you framed this in kind of two ways as to what this could represent. I think a lot of that aligns with what Tania was saying. If you want to kind of just jump into that and then also react to what Tania just said.
Sure. Yeah. I think you're right with the two phrasing style. I think there's two ways you can look at this. This was always going to get challenged by the courts. Okay, this was never an executive order that I think anyone had any doubt. So you can look at that and say, number one, is this administration that incompetent and ignorant? And there have been serious questions about Trump's knowledge of the inner workings of government in 2016 when he first took office, and he clearly struggled with a lot of these things. But I think there could be something else at play, which is either ignorance or it's a power play. It's a test. And this is the weakening of the American Congress and legislative branch has been a story that's spanned over the last 4 presidents. Maybe even you can go back quite a ways, even past that. And I think this is another step in that line. Biden froze a lot of the student loan repayment, which was a much smaller foray into interrupting scheduled payments by the legislative branch. But I think, in my opinion, this is him testing how far he can push, like Tania said, his Republican colleagues to get in line with his agenda. Because use that word in the memo, consistent with his agenda. Okay, well, what does that mean? That's the part where I tend to side with some of my more liberal friends, where it's like, I don't, that seems like you're pushing the limit of what the president should be able to do. So yeah, I think you kind of have to categorize it as one of two things, because this was always going to get shot down. So
yeah, no, absolutely. I think that I mean, you mentioned this is a very long story going back at least past 4 presidents. I would be inclined to agree this goes back much further than that. I mean,
yes,
obviously you have executive aggrandizement, especially with, like, I think maybe one of the earliest examples of this really, really happening, and I'm not a historian, so don't quote me on this, but like you go back to Andrew Jackson, a lot of the executive activity that he engaged in greatly expanded the power of presidency. I think another great example is Theodore Roosevelt's approach to government, where not really asking what powers does the president have, but what does the Constitution say the president can't do? I'm going to do everything else. So yeah, this might just be another instance of that. I'm not sure. Only time will tell. But I think that we're kind of on the same page as far as how this probably should have been handled. We probably want greater transparency or greater clarification going into this, greater caution, etc. Let's maybe pursue something where there might be more divergence here. Obviously, the backdrop of all of this is government efficiency in general, right? And we have the Department of Government Efficiency run by Elon Musk currently. That's going through cutting lots of spending in places, reassessing government's funding. Also, apparently one of the main purposes of this department is to improve the government's IT systems, all that sort of thing. They're doing things like, well, this is kind of a side tangent, but one thing that they were looking at actually, which I hadn't no knowledge of before. Apparently, producing a unit of like a single penny costs more than what a penny's worth. And so they're like thinking about eradicating the production of pennies, like things like that to just go through and try to improve federal efficiency. I just saw that in an article. I thought that was kind of funny. But I think the center stage here has been DEI initiatives. Even though DEI since 2021 has only occupied about, it's taken about $1 billion in federal funding, which compared to all federal funding, that's like a drop in the account. So it's not a massive, sponge for federal funding here, but it takes a great deal of symbolic importance, ideological importance, and obviously Trump has been focusing on it quite a lot. Even with the recent plane crash, he connected this to DEI initiatives. There's kind of a weird interaction with the press there. But let's maybe turn our attention there. And just kind of this push to reduce DEI, cut spending there, improve government efficiency more broadly. Let's see where we stand there, and then see where the conversation takes us. I would say, Tania, let's start with you. Kind of just go down the same order again. What are your thoughts here?
First and foremost, I don't really understand the controversy around DEI because DEI initiatives and policies have been here for decades. Since the beginning of the United States, since it was founded, DEI has been there. And without that particular acronym, it's been here before. We have, the 1965 order, burying employment discrimination. We have, I believe it's Title IX. We have so many things that were DEI initiatives, but it became politicized and really blew up due to the protests that we can really bring down to as the George Floyd ones. That's when we see, DEI, and then we see the numerous shootings of Black Americans, and suddenly DEI is the topic we have to be talking about. We have to do more DEI to fix all the injustices in the United States. And in response, we see corporations saying, hey, we're pro civil rights because we're boosting awareness of historical and structural biases. Don't come after us, But this attack is just a play. It's just ignoring the broader problems of the United States has, because at least from my perspective, maybe this is where you guys can say I'm a bit more liberal, but DEI was a response to the structural barriers. That's me asserting the belief that there is still structures of discrimination and racism, right? You can't deny that. And I think DEI, when used properly, it's a good thing and it just secures people. Now, do I think that by removing these policies, do I think we're going to go back in time where we're discriminating against people based on their gender and their sexual identity? No, I don't think so. But it's still a bit of a wow factor for me, the fact that we're still using this, or I guess for me, I'm going to say, guys, I hate how it's been sort of like perverted to be this very bad thing, but I don't really think it has been, right? But, I don't know. I don't understand it. Do I agree with it? No, I think DEI has a place in the federal government. I believe it has a place in higher education. So I very much don't believe this is just, how do I explain this? He didn't have to terminate all discriminatory programs because we're still going to have that in place, but just saying, I don't want DEI in name. Okay, we're not going to have DEI in name, but we're still going to have the policy. So I'm not really concerned in the long run. It's more so I'm like, God, dude, like there's other things we can talk about. Like, let's move on.
Yeah, no, I think that goes along with the point that really when we consider this, it's not that big of a spending issue compared to everything else we're looking at, and yet it draws so much media attention, so much public attention, so much attention from the presidency, from public comments, etc. Obviously, there's just kind of like a deeper ideological underpinning here, or sort of a story or a narrative that's being played for partisan or political reasons. At least that seems to be the case to me. So I agree with a lot of what you said. That said, I don't want to assume anything about your positions and all of this, Eric, but
Sure.
as a self-described conservative, I'd imagine maybe you have some different views on the value or maybe the significance or the underpinnings of DEI. So if you can just kind of walk us through where you're coming from when you approach this issue.
Absolutely. So, I think when you guys talk about federal spending on DEI initiatives, you're right. That's going to be a number that's going to be relatively small when compared to other outlays and other expenditures. But I see DEI being on the table for conservatives and a winning issue for conservatives and Republicans alike because it's infiltrated the corporate world. Um, the three largest holders of private equity in the world hold about 33% of all American savings. They're BlackRock, Vanguard, ESG. This kind of started in 2016 with ESG, environmental social governance, and pushing these more DEI agendas onto larger businesses so that in order to receive advertising funds and in order to be kind of involved and BlackRock's investment portfolio, you had to kind of comply to some of these standards. And so you see DEI offices, in a bunch of corporations, like the big four accounting firms, just to take some for examples. This is a new thing for them. So while Tanya, I agree that DEI has been around for a while, the kind of social push is a newer thing. And I think 2020 was a capstone year in a lot of ways. But I think it kind of forced all these issues collectively onto the table. So yeah, and when I really start to see a problem with DEI initiatives in particular is when we start talking about quotas. So racial quotas are something that makes me very uncomfortable because that's actually something that was outlawed in some of the Civil War amendments, 13, 14, and by one of the reasons I think that Trump was repealed LBJ's executive order on this issue was that he wanted to get rid of the diversity, quotas, which has been a legal bastion for people on the left to say, oh, your business doesn't have X, Y amount of black, white, Asian, Hispanic, or homosexual people. So we're going to sue you because, your list of workers doesn't look like it's diverse. So therefore your practices must not be diverse. So there's an interplay, I think, between the corporate world and some of the pushback on these DEI initiatives. But you're right. Generally, I tend to think that you got to put something at the cornerstone of a company or a government, and I think you have to have a directional policy, and I think that needs to be based around merit, not around any outward characteristics. So this is an MLK idea too: judge a man by the character of his by his own character and not the color of his skin. So I think there's a lot of ways we could take this direction. Do I think some of it is overblown on the federal level? Absolutely. I don't think I would love to see DEI programs torn down in a kind of systemic quota way. That's what I think is kind of unjust. Even in academia as well. I don't think there needs to be a head count, a racial head count, or an identity based head count in any way. I think that's diverging a lot from what we set out to do. And Tanya, like you mentioned in the last podcast, this thankfully this country is too woke to accept something like that. If we were to ever see a true racist kind of ideology encapsulated business, I think people would reject it. I believe that. Now, granted, maybe you can argue that DEI makes sure that that never happens. But, I think if you erased all these things tomorrow with the snap of your fingers, I don't think we're going to see a return to 50s and 40s, Jim Crow era politics. I don't think that's what's going to happen. And I think the most important thing for government and, corporations alike is to kind of recenter merit and get away from these racial quotas. Having diversity as a pillar stone of your organization, I think is useful in a lot of ways. It's hard to argue that it's not useful, but I don't think it should be the center goal of any organization, whether that be for profit or for business and government.
No, I'm sympathetic to a lot of what you said there, but I do want to dig in a little more to some of what Tania mentioned and kind of where we stand there on this idea of structural impediments that continue to exist to the present day and how we address those. Obviously, if we aren't implementing, say, racial quotas and saying, okay, you need this percentage of this demographic in this business, etc., is there a way to address maybe structural or systemic or institutional discrimination? Is that, a notion that you find plausible? I know a lot of conservatives, say that the idea itself can be very easily muddled or, is overblown or even just isn't true. So if maybe we could get a better idea of kind of where you stand there, and we can move forward in the conversation that way. One other thing I will mention, just really briefly before you respond to that. I agree that, the United States is in many ways kind of too woke to allow for this sort of like overt racism. At least that seems to be the case to me. We never know for sure. Who knows what the future holds? But I mean, that seems plausible, right? A company's engaging in overtly racist behavior, ideological racism or prejudice, in another sense, maybe based on sexual orientation or something like that. I mean, generally speaking, perhaps unless we're dealing with a religious organization, there's going to be a great deal of public outcry. I mean, even if we are dealing with a religious organization. But I think that one of the issues addressed by DEI and a lot of contemporary theories on that is the idea that the discrimination that is prominent today is more subtle or different than this overt prejudice or racism, etc. That there's this idea of kind of like an uneven playing field as a result of these institutional and structural factors, through decades, centuries of discrimination. And that when we put, say, a bunch of completely neutral policies or laws atop this uneven environment, it really just reinforces and masks, discrimination or inequity or whatever else. So now that I've kind of just thrown all of that out there, I want to get your perspective, Eric, on some of these deeper questions and kind of how you react to this, and maybe how for you we should address these things in policy, if at all.
Yeah, well, I think you said a key word there for me. If you're laying out a neutral policy and you're trying to weight it so that, a previously or currently discriminized group is no longer discriminized, you're falling back into that same trap of thinking that I'm really originally hoping to avoid. I think you have to have, I don't believe in a colorblind society, as some conservatives have mentioned. But I think in terms of, legal writing, whether that be laws or whether that be executive orders or company bylaws, I do think you need to have a colorless approach. And you might say, well, hey, there's going to be places that skirt around the rules with discrimination. And I would say it's up to us to call that out and to not withstand that, and to not, allow that to happen in our communities. And I don't think that we will. So no, I don't believe in, kind of doing systemic solutions to systemic problems. That might sound like, of course you have to do that. But I think this is more an individual based solution. And it can only be because racism and hatred only survives in the individual heart. You can try to quash it through every government measure that you can, through every law. And at the end of the day, it's always going to be there. So I think it's up to us as a citizenry to handle these problems, not for the government to try to reorient the balances of the scale, if you will.
Thank you for explaining that. Tania, you kind of, in bringing up kind of the structural factors here, you started us down this avenue of the conversation. Let's go back to you, and what's your reaction to everything that Eric has said here?
No, yeah. I mean, no, I do kind of agree with Eric that sometimes it's really hard to address those structural issues with policy. It took us a long time to move away from like the Jim Crow era thing, segregation, and it's gonna take us a long time, way after we're dead. It'll eventually ease itself away. But what I think though,
Mm-hmm.
what bringing it back to DEI is that for at least this is where we start diverting, right? So I don't see DEI as setting these quotas for specific race or gender identities or whatever. I don't see it that way. Instead, what I actually see it doing is building up this meritocracy, right? It's looking past the apparent, distinguishing factors that we have, which is race, which is gender identity with sexuality. I think it's looking past that and telling our employers, go look for those who are typically marginalized, look in those areas, see if they have a candidate in there in that pool, that you could bring into your network. And that's not saying that we're going to get someone underqualified. We're not saying, oh, like if it's a black person who has this Ivy League degree and we have this white person Ivy League degree, we're going to go with the black person. No, I don't think that's how it is. I think what it actually is just enforcing this idea that we have to look past these certain things in order to create an equitable society. Now, is it equitable society realistic? Probably not. Probably not. It's not. But what it does, it forces in a way, maybe forces is a bad word, but it's probably right, forces the employer to look beyond what they see on the paper. Look beyond that. Look at what the qualifiers are. And I think we do get that with DEI, but that's where we separate, right? Because when we look at the laws, diversity quotas are illegal. I think if a company were to be proven to be doing that, they will come under fire, and I will be one who will not come to defend them, because I'd be like, why are you hiring based on race and gender? That's pretty weird. That's just that's just wrong, and I agree that's wrong. But I think that's where DEI, what we all believe it to be, diverges. But I do think people have used DEI in a negative way, right? I do believe they've used it in a way that just washes out the true purpose of DEI, which is just having this social and cultural understanding that the United States is so diverse, and recognizing that there are structures in place that are preventing people from securing the American dream. And we have to recognize this constant recognition this exists. Also, this is when you're working for a federal government, like I am, you always doing these sensitivity trainings, and I basically call them how not to be a dick trainings, right? Aware. And I think that's fine. I'm like, okay, I know I'm a brown person, but I don't know the Black experiences. I'm not going to assume it. So let me not be a dick about it. Let me just be a bit more aware of what I'm going to be saying, making sure I'm not generalizing a whole group of people, right? But that's how I do it.
Yeah. No, thank you for that, Tania. No, I love the way that you put that. Yeah, let me maybe, well, first of all, I guess the first thing to acknowledge here that I think is really, really important is definitions. I think that a lot of this gets very, very muddled because when people start talking about DEI, we don't really know what we're talking about anymore, and maybe we're talking about completely different things.
That's probably true.
Yeah, I think that happens time and time again. I think the same thing happens when we start talking about, critical race theory or Marxism, which is often thrown around in these discussions. That's a whole nother thing. I just think that, we need to be very clear about what precisely we're talking about. So, Tania, just to clarify, when you're talking about DEI, you're referring to things like sensitivity or don't be a dick training. Try to understand, these structural barriers, try to understand, where other people are, what their experiences are like, try to be sensitive to that, and try to integrate that into a workplace culture. And then, Eric, when you say DEI, you're talking more about affirmative action and quotas. I mean, are these accurate assessments of where you're both coming from?
Yeah, that's pretty accurate.
Yeah, I definitely emphasizing the social and cultural themes of the United States. I think that's for me what DEI is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no. Then let me put something past you here, and then we're getting low on time here. So maybe just to kind of wrap up at least this portion of the conversation. If we Eric, you mentioned how it seems that your primary method for addressing some of these issues is on the individual basis. We look for instances of discrimination, we call it out. It's the culture, it's individuals, it's social norms that are going to fix this, not some kind of bloated and incompetent government measure or something like that. And Tania, it seems that this issue, in your view, would also require some explicit training in the workforce, etc. That's all fine. But I guess two things here that might pose obstacles potentially to both of these solutions. One, I have read, and I'm no expert on this, but I know there are a lot of concerns here that sensitivity training itself doesn't actually do much to reduce unconscious bias. I think it depends on who you ask, it depends on what measures you're looking for, but I've heard that concern levied a lot. That the tangible effects are difficult to measure, and this might play into a lot of what, say, Trump and Musk are saying on government efficiency. If we're spending a lot on DEI training programs, or at least, a bit on them, and we aren't seeing tangible benefits, how do we measure their effectiveness? How do we measure their efficiency? Is this actually a policy worth pursuing? So let's actually just start there. I don't want to throw too much information here right now, and then we'll go to kind of the solution Eric seems to be promoting here.
Yeah, so tangible effects are difficult to measure. It's a good argument because it's true. How do you measure someone's bias? How do you measure unconscious bias? But that's why we need these constant trainings in order to give this like idea of what you should be accepting in a workforce and should not be accepting of. And I think it's the most obvious things we're not going to be accepting of is just bland racism. Of course, we all recognize that, but there's things like these unconscious biases. This is something we have to tackle with and understand. Why do I have this perspective? What fed into this? Why do I still have it? And is this preventing me from, interacting with colleagues, preventing me from scaling up the ladder? I think these are constant thoughts we need to have. And while it's true that these the DEI trainings are very much like watch this video, answer this question, click next, it doesn't do much. But that's where we need to have these bigger conversations at hand. And an example I'll bring to the table is this sort of idea of like, let's look at this idea of classroom inclusivity, right? In classrooms, are we integrating what exactly Black history means? Are we bringing in those examples? Are we bringing in even, I would say, like LGBT month, Pride month, sorry, Pride month. Like, are we like throughout the year, are we bringing up the fact of Marsha, her name, my bad, her name. So like, are we bringing up the trans pioneers in there? Are we constantly referencing them, creating a classroom of inclusivity in order to counter these unconscious biases, in order to sort of normalize these sort of heroes in their own specific fields, right? So that's where I think DEI still has a place in these things. Now, again, how do we measure it? I don't really know. I can't really give you an answer. But I do think because we are human beings, we're going to have these unconscious biases. We're always going to have people who are racist. It's like a service to the country to order to continue having these trainings. I think without it, there is a risk, I believe, for the more obscure, what's the word? Be like microaggressions to become bigger, right? I think that if we don't have these trainings, we're just going to let these biases go unchecked, and that's what happens when you're working in a workforce, you're a minority, you have with majority who's going to have this certain perspective. What can you do? If you have no system to support you, but when you have that DEI area in your work, you can lean on them. They will support you. And that's where I believe it's important. Now, this is only in particular sectors that are, very heavily one particular demographic or particular gender. We reference the engineering world, right? It's very male heavy. And then if you're a woman in that area, how are they assuring your protection and your security if these men are not becoming aware of exactly what their biases may be towards women? Maybe they're woke enough where they recognize this, but we just can't guarantee that because we can't measure it. So that's where I think we need to have these things.
Yeah, no, thank you for explaining that, Tania. I mean, just going based off of what you said, I wonder if a lot of the value here isn't necessarily, oh, we can show that we've decreased discrimination by this statistical amount, but is maybe just the value inherent in education more generally and being exposed to alternative perspectives. And what people do with that, I mean, that's up to them. So I'm not sure, as you said, how we measure the effect here precisely. I'd imagine there are creative ways to attempt to do that. I don't know how effective they are. I don't know how controversial they are. But in any case, maybe there's just some basic educational value here. Eric, feel free to respond to anything that Tania and I have said here. But one other question I want to make sure that we pose to you here. I know that a lot of progressives, and in many ways I'm inclined to this view myself, would state that it would be difficult to just rely on, say, something like public outcry or individual norms for addressing a lot of these problems, at least in our current state, just because they are very different from, say, like overt racism or overt prejudice, ideological prejudice, etc. If we're talking about something like, say, one that's been studied time and time again is hiring practices in relation to ethnic names, right? So you have a name that sounds really white, like Charles Johnson. You have a name that sounds in our American culture sounds more ethnic or quote unquote exotic or whatever else, like from that standpoint. and there's a big hiring disparity in the number of callbacks. And I mean, this has been replicated time and again. There's a pretty significant disparity most of the time. At least that's to my knowledge, based on what I've seen from these studies. There might also be other instances, like for instance, intergenerational wealth affected by past institutional racism, which then contributes to disparate rates of poverty among a certain group. I think African Americans are an obvious example here. And then people start to see that and say, well, there's lesser rates of a meritocratic attitude or a desire to improve one's well-being or increase laziness, etc., among this group, when maybe more predictive power is on institutional racism and the issues of intergenerational wealth, etc. A lot of this analysis goes beyond and is underneath overt discrimination or actually, like actual ideological racial prejudice that people would look at and be able to call out really explicitly. So it seems to me that maybe something needs to accompany some sort of measure, I don't know, or even just a different attitude if we don't want to involve government at all. In addressing these issues, maybe what Tania is talking about in terms of sensitivity training or educating ourselves more thoroughly on the basis of these disparities is a route to pursue here. I don't know. Just what are your thoughts on that and how it applies to this idea of using individuals to address these systemic issues, and just your reaction to the whole sensitivity training issue more broadly. I realize I'm throwing a lot at you, but I'm
No,
sure you have a
you're
lot of
fine.
thoughts.
You're fine. Yeah. So, I think we talk a lot, and, I can't, this is probably an area where we're going to get some real disagreement here because,
Mhm.
I hear a lot about unconscious bias.
Mm.
And to me, it seems, I like studying different religions and religious symbolisms. And it seems to be this original sin, in the way that we kind of talk about it, that it's something everyone has. It's something almost like, why are humans have this bad piece of us? Why do we have this good piece of us? It seems like it's something
Mm.
that's endemic within us. This unconscious bias and therefore this unconscious racism. And I don't really think that's true. I think there are people that certainly are racist, but I think that's more of a conscious choice. And I think when we start to try to tangle with the unconscious, we need to be very careful. And
Mm.
especially when we invite government into that space, when we invite government into the hiring rooms of different corporations, because look, in a perfectly just world, I wouldn't want to see any of these discriminatory practices either. But we're talking about solutions, not problems here. And I don't
Mm.
think the solution is as obvious as some on the left might think it is, which is that, hey, you just slap a law in place, you just slap a body in place, and it gets dissolved. I think that's going to wind up having the reverse effect, actually. And I think Sam, you quoted some studies on sensitivity training. Oftentimes there's a backlash to this kind of stuff because
Yeah.
I believe, like I said, in a more colorblind approach, not totally, but a more colorblind approach, where I think it's people are aware of their differences. Like people are aware of cultural differences, and if they're not, well, that's something that they will be educated by our culture with, and should be educated, via the school system and other things.
Mm.
Um, but I don't think anyone's learning anything in these sensitivity trainings about stereotypes and generalizations. I mean, this is stuff that we were taught when we were 6 years old. And I think that's kind of what I'm talking about with this original sin mentality with unconscious bias.
Mm.
You're never going to defeat it, right? If it's real. And I think there's aspects of this that are certainly true. But, I think this fact that every white person is born with this inherent bias towards people who look like each other, I think
Mm.
you can make an argument on this bioethical realm, and I start getting really uncomfortable with that, and I
Yeah.
disagree with that because I don't see that in my own day to day life. And maybe you could say there's your problem, Eric. But no, I think I think it goes back to individual solutions because the other answer is a systemic solution, and I don't
Mm.
think we want what comes with that
Yeah.
in terms of negative backlash. So that's kind of where I stand.
Mm-hmm. No, Eric. Despite the fact that we might disagree on some elements of this issue, I do agree with a lot of what you said. First of all, I'm not inclined to believe that a heavy-handed government solution is automatically the response that we should take. And I think if we invite government at all, it needs to be very, very cautious,
Yeah.
very carefully analyzed. And that's obviously not something that we have the time or expertise to do here. But
I'm sorry, Sam. I want to jump in to clarify something. There
yeah,
should be laws in place against these discriminatory practices. It's
oh
about
yeah,
how
absolutely.
they're executed. It's
Yeah, when
about
we start talking about like
I
quotas and
don't
stuff.
want people to misunderstand me.
Yeah,
But I think it's a difference in taste of execution to these laws that I think that's
mhm,
really what we're talking about in the general conversation. 'Cause, I don't
yeah.
think many people, especially on this platform, are filled with hatred.
No,
No,
I
yeah,
would.
no, absolutely. No, I didn't have that misunderstanding. I think that's yeah, we're talking about the like DI initiatives added on to kind of like a baseline anti-discrimination set of laws that have been implemented since the civil rights era. Um, but yeah, I also agree that when we talk about things like unconscious bias, we need to stay away from like essentialism and dogma. I think that insofar as these things exist, and I do think that they exist, from the studies that I've seen, they're socialized and they are malleable. They're
That's a
historically
great
and
point.
culturally contingent. I don't, I think maybe there's like a biological component in the sense of just basic in-group, out-group bias. But how we frame those groups, that's very malleable. So I agree that we need to be careful about how we talk about these subjects. But I mean, nevertheless, we're kind of running out of time here. This is obviously a very big topic.
Yeah.
Any final thoughts here? I want to make sure that we aren't like cutting anyone off. We've talked a lot about how we perceive this problem. We've talked a little bit about potential solutions here. Just any other thoughts on either DEI or our original topic before we segued here, just government efficiency in general?
Hmm.
I
I
think we've about
really
covered it.
think this idea of approaching of America as a business, do we think that's something that's realistic? Because it seems that's what we're doing. We're cutting a
That's a
lot of
good question.
Oh yeah.
in order to, make these programs more efficient. But is that the right way to do it, or should we just look at restructuring these programs, as in looking like a policy analysis? I wonder why we went straight to cutting costs instead of looking at these programs and say, okay, what is effective in this program, what's not? And if it's not effective, why isn't it? And what could we change, or should we just do away with it? So I wonder what we think about that.
Hmm. Yeah. I have some thoughts, but my answers are long-winded. Let's go to Eric.
um, yeah, sure. I mean, I think there's a delicate interplay because a business is not a government and a government is not a business. But that being said, I think there's some obvious similarities. You have your intakes and you have your outlays. You have your research, which I guess you could say consider federal funding for grants, and you have your design, which would be more military contractors and stuff like that. So there's certainly similarities, and I think efficiency, whenever there's money, is never a bad thing in its original idea. Um, but I agree. I think we need to be a little bit more sensitive when we talk about cost as pure cost, because there's people at the bottom of these costs. This is something that I've dealt with in state government as well, locally in Louisiana, which is that if you want to cut taxes, it's coming from somewhere. You're gonna cut the meat off the animal at some point. Um, and look, there's a lot of things that Doge is saying and signaling that I think is very on the margins.
Mhm,
Because we're not even, I don't know if we have time to get into all the mandatory versus discretionary, and
mhm,
the interest on the debt, which is a far bigger problem than any spending
mhm,
Doge is going to be able to cut. Um,
mhm,
but yeah, I think there's some room for cutting. But I generally agree with Tanya. It's not wise to just take this as a business.
mhm. Yeah. No, I'm inclined to agree there. I mean, even if you go back to like, basic, like for market efficiency, laissez-faire, invisible hand kind of approach, the government still isn't treated as a business there. In fact, the government is sort of like meant to do just what the private market can't and then leave everything else to the market, right? Even in that very libertarian perspective. So I mean, agree. I don't think that treating the government as a business entirely is the approach to go. But I mean, that doesn't mean that we can't improve spending efficiency. And I think that the basic idea behind the Department of Government Efficiency is a sound one, even if maybe we don't agree with every single practice or its degree of transparency, etc. Um, but yeah, no, I think we're on the same page there.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
have one more question actually that I think is kind of important to ask everyone here. Is
Mm,
what back to the idea of the federal funding freeze? what can we expect the freeze on federal funding like programs to actually mean? Like, what programs do we think are actually going to be
Oh,
effective?
God.
It's still not clear to me because I'm referencing something that the secretary said now. It says so. Any program that provides direct benefits to Americans is explicitly excluded from the pause. So that's a lot of programs. So I'm confused.
Yeah, what does that mean?
Means
Yeah.
like from like Social Security to Head Start. Obviously, we're keeping those, but like, what else is there to take away? Like, like I wish again. I think we're all in mutual agreement is that I wish there was a plan that was sent out before the memo was sent out, before some of these EOs are sent. I wish there was a list of reasoning and some examples to provide the American people, because I think that just allowed this confusion and this fear, and which is why you had so many lawsuits coming out, right? And the judges striking this down, saying the memos, like pausing the memo because of the potential harm to things like healthcare and like to road construction, right? So I want to know, like, what do you think would actually be cut? Do we know anything?
Oh gosh, I don't know anything. I think if everyone's confused, like I'm gonna be no better. I think the only people who know this potentially are like a portion of the White House, and even then, I don't know if they really know precisely. So yeah, that's my answer.
Yeah, I think a lot of this is Trump riding the biggest wave of popularity he's ever had. When in terms of 2020, around that election, clearly unpopular. And then even when he won in 2016, it was quite a slim margin. So I think a lot of what you're seeing in these early days is, posturing. You're seeing a lot of JD Vance be sent into the media to be his attack dog and just making a lot of noise in Washington to look like he's delivering on a lot of his promises. And to his credit, he is. He's doing a lot of the things that he said he would, for better or worse, in some people's opinion. But I still think there's a whole lot of undecideds, and I think that's why we're not getting those nice, beautiful, laid out plans that we're talking about.
All right. Okay. Well, I'd love to keep talking, but we don't want to keep this podcast too long. Just thank you guys. Thank you, Tania. Thank you, Eric, for coming today. I felt this was a productive conversation at the very least. I feel like I learned something about your perspectives. I mean, I went into this. I knew that we were probably going to talk about DEI a little bit. And I went into this with a particular conception of maybe the conservative perspective. And I think you've altered that a bit through this discussion, Eric. So I appreciate
I'm happy
that.
to hear that.
No, yeah, absolutely. And yeah, Tanya, thank you for all of your comments and questions. And yeah, I just thought this was great. Thanks, guys.
Yeah, fun time, as always.
This podcast was brought to you by Our National Conversation, a place where students generate policy solutions to the biggest problems facing America. Join us in freeing political dialogue from hyperpartisanship. To learn more about what you heard today, check us out at ournationalconversation.org. You can also follow us on social media at Our National Conversation to show your support and keep up with our latest efforts.